Welcome to a brief overview of the EnergyPlus utility createRulesetProjectDescription. I'm the main developer for the utility, as well as being the vice chair of SPC 229, which is developing the standard directly related to this topic. The createRPD software was intended to be used by EnergyPlus modelers or as a utility included with software that uses EnergyPlus as a simulation engine behind a user interface, such as Design Builder, Trace 3D Plus, Symergy, Energy Gauge, Open Studio, and several others. We are going to cover a variety of introductory topics today, and I hope they align with what you are interested in. I will start off with some basic background concepts, and will end with a tour of some of the existing code for the createRPD utility. This is not intended to be comprehensive as the title suggests. It's just an overview, and I hope that is enough to get you started. Also note that there are quite a few links in the presentation, and I will be posting a PDF so that you can click on as many as you want. If you are watching this video, you most likely already have an understanding, at least a little bit, of ASHRAE Standard 229. But for those that aren't as familiar, I'm going to provide a real quick description so you can understand the context of this software. Right now, if you are using 90.1 Appendix G or some other building energy modeling based compliance, you probably submit the results of your proposed building models and the baseline building models by looking at the inputs and results and filling out a bunch of forms. A reviewer either rubber stamps it or asks you to fix 100 little things in your model, and then you resubmit the forms. With 229, if it gets widely adopted, this process should be much easier. Your simulation program will generate one or more RPD rule set project description files automatically that include all the stuff that you would have gone on the forms and more. In fact, the RPD file will contain most of the information needed to confirm that the simulation model for the baseline and proposed are consistent with the rules of a rule set, such as Appendix G or something else. Another piece of software, called the Rule Set Checking Tool, will read the RPD files and check a huge number of rules automatically and make sure they are consistent with the Appendix G rule set. This will be a web service. So as a modeler, you can figure out before you even submit the files what might be wrong and fix them. No more copying and pasting values from your models, and no more waiting to see if the models are acceptable. Standard 229 defines the RPD file format and the test to make sure the rule set checking tool is working properly. This software, createRPD, is what creates the RPD files for EnergyPlus. It is just one piece of what is needed, but one that is crucial. So, if you're not sure what the data schema is, just think of the RPD file as a very complicated form that gets filled out automatically for you by just using this software. The format of the file is called the Rule Set Evaluation Schema, which says how the RPD file is organized and if a particular input is a number or an option from a list or something else. The rule set model description is a major chunk of the RPD file that represents the inputs and results from a single simulation, such as for the proposed building or the baseline building, perhaps at a certain degree of rotation. Let me show you this RPD file that is on the screen, just so you get a more concrete idea about it. So let me scroll up to the top here. So this is the top of the file, and you can see it's got a lot of nesting. Everything is a pair, a key value pair. Each value has site shading as false here. It starts with buildings, or it actually starts with rule set model descriptions and buildings, building segment, and then under each building segment it's HVAC systems, and we go down a little further. Let's see. right around here, you can see it starts talking about different zones. So the first thing it does is define surfaces for the zone, and then within each surface is a construction. We scroll down a little bit further, you can see that the zone also includes things like infiltration and then spaces. So in general, it's a lot like what you'd expect an input file to be for any kind of simulation software that's nested, but it's not an input file. It's this RPD file that is a kind of a summary of inputs and outputs from a simulation. Here's a more graphic representation of the expected process. The top box shows the modeler creating the proposed and baseline buildings. Sometimes the software helps with that. Then the createRPD file or software is that middle box and is what creates the RPD file or files that contain the information from the building models, like a very detailed form being filled out automatically. Then the bottom box is the rule set checking tool that the code official or rating authority would use to see if the models are consistent with the rule set. Since you also will have access to the rule set checking tool, you can make sure everything looks good before you submit them. And then finally, a project evaluation report comes out, and the reviewer gets to take a look at that. So createRPD is what I usually call the create rule set project description, since it's such a mouthful. It is a software that creates the files in a format specified by Standard 229P that can be used to summarize your baseline and proposed files. It is being developed right now and is not complete, but it does support a variety of data about building models. You can look at the source code since it's being developed on a public GitHub repository. If you are a software developer hoping to include createRPD with your modeling software, it could be included directly, or if you don't have Python as part of your distribution, you can always include something like PyInstaller to create an exe to include. The license that it uses is a pretty standard 2-clause BSD license, which is very permissive for both open source software and closed software. So commercial software can use it just as well. If you want to know more about the license, you can see the link or just Google it. The development status is a difficult slide to create for a video that's going to be on YouTube for probably a year or two, since it's going to be out of date and very inaccurate soon. Today, early September 2024, we are almost finished with the third phase of work for createRPD. The first two phases mostly focused on the building envelope and internal loads parts of the data model, with just enough HVAC information to help classify different zones. Phase 3 work was pretty much all about HVAC. We have been working on adding new reports to EnergyPlus so that various details are available for the createRPD software to populate the RPD files. These are new reports in EnergyPlus, so we have modified the source code of EnergyPlus to add them. These changes will all be in EnergyPlus 24.2. We are also done writing the Python code for createRPD that takes the result reports from EnergyPlus and puts them into this RPD format. The code has been written and is just waiting on some external reviews. The new EnergyPlus reports have the advantage of just being generally useful, and I think modelers would like to see the results for what they show, even if they don't care about 90.1 or 229 at this point. This is not the end of the development for createRPD, since it does not support the entire schema yet, and the schema itself is likely to change before the standard 229P is finally published, since it's still going through the process of being developed itself. Three more details about the development status of createRPD. We've been trying to keep unit test code coverage as high so that we have confidence in the RPD generation. Most of these unit tests are simply setting up some imaginary EnergyPlus output and running a routine to see if it gets what we are expecting. Not rocket science, but nevertheless, they do provide assurance that everything is working. We have added special EnergyPlus related tags to the 229 schema on a special branch just to help keep track of what we are doing to get information from the reports. I update this when I'm programming, and every time that I run the createRPD file, a special report is generated that summarizes those changes. It is essentially just my way of keeping track of a complicated checklist, but since it's part of the repo, you can see it anytime I have put new code on GitHub and see the status. The different statuses I thought I would go through really quick, and then I'll show you the file itself. Done using input means that the data element is fully implemented and being populated by the EPJSON input file to EnergyPlus. As I said earlier, we are trying not to use this too much since the focus is on getting results from the output side. Most of the results that are done are using the done using output, which means the data element is fully implemented and being populated by the output file. Almost all of these are from the tabular HTML kind of output file that everyone is familiar with. But we're actually using the JSON version of that output file since this software is very JSON oriented. Done using constant means that the data element is fully implemented, but the value is simply a constant. Those are really easy. The partial using input, partial using output, and partial using constant are like these last three, but I've only implemented part of the data element, usually the most common cases. I recognize there are some edge cases that have not been implemented yet. This is good enough for an initial implementation, but work still needs to be done on these. Not required indicates that the data element is not really needed at all. It is sometimes an optional element like reporting name or notes that occur on a lot of data groups. Other times, not required is used when there are multiple options of how to report something and an option that has been chosen that doesn't actually use that data element. Not started are part of the schema that I'd really like to get implemented, but are not yet and haven't even been started on. There are a lot of these in service water heating specifically, but there are still plenty scattered around. Some are not used by the RCT program, so their implementation is not on a critical path. The to-do flag I use at the beginning of a programming task, basically just to sketch out what I'm trying to get done in that time. I don't think there are any to-dos left in this list. Compliance parameter, I will talk about those more soon, but these are data elements that are known to the modeler or design team, but generally are not part of EnergyPlus input or output. They are needed often to categorize aspects of the building, but are entered basically using a side channel instead of being from EnergyPlus input or output. And let me show you that. So let me go back up to where it's a good example. So this is the YAML file that contains all those statuses, and this is for the surface data group. And the status is right here where it says EP status done using output. But the rest of these special EPtags you'll see have to do with describing where this is basically just to keep, for myself to keep track of where everything is coming from. But if it's coming from the output side, it comes from the table HTML, the envelope summary, opaque exterior, etc. for that one. In fact, there's a better example down here. If we look at area here, it comes from the envelope summary table, opaque exterior, gross area. So, and this one is also done using output. So if you look at all that, you see that the statuses are for each data element, and then in the implementation report that I talked about briefly, it basically just summarizes this. And this is mostly for myself to keep track of things, but you can see that for the surface data group, a lot of it's been done using output, some using input, some with constants, and then one optical properties here has not been started yet. So this is just a way for me to keep track of things. And then finally, there's also a compliance parameter status type at the end. All right. So I thought I would step through some of the major concepts behind the software, get into a little bit more detail. So first, after significant discussion with the EnergyPlus development team about the best way to get the information about the model into the RPD file, we decided that the output from the EnergyPlus was the approach to take, primarily based on the tabular output file. This has a bunch of advantages, but there's also some disadvantages. Obviously, new reports are needed for any data element that currently isn't supported. So there's quite a bit of those. So we need to add new output reports and new columns to existing reports. The advantages, though, outweigh this. First, we always will need to look at some outputs for, let's say, auto-size capacities. There's no way to avoid that. We need the output as well. And by focusing output, we don't need to worry about if the version of the output and input files match completely. You know, an input file can be modified without the output file being modified if the simulation hasn't been run. So that avoids some confusion. Also, ultimately, many EnergyPlus inputs are sometimes mapped to a single output table. There's lots of ways to describe surfaces, lots of ways to describe DX systems, and even though there's a lot of ways to do that on the input side, they all end up with a single table on the output side. So EnergyPlus is already doing this collecting of information. And the last reason is that while both input and output change over time, input changes a little bit more rapidly. And just to reduce the burden of maintenance on this software, we decided that if we stick with the output, it's more likely to be not needing changes as frequently. Current version actually does use some input, but perhaps in a future version won't be using any input at all. All right, so the next thing is how JSON-centric the software is. The RPD file format is a JSON file format, and that library is built into Python. So basically we decided to kind of use it for everything. Scraping a tabular file using HTML or even tab formatted is not fun and can actually lead to errors and complicated situations. So we decided to go with a JSON output file, which is structured and very easy to parse. The hourly results are also needed for schedules, but that's also easily produced by EnergyPlus in a JSON format. For a GUI, requesting these outputs can always be added to what the user wants, and these extra files deleted if not necessary. One thing that I did learn in this effort is that pulling data out of a JSON formatted tabular output file, this out.json file, is really easy with Python and probably every other scripting language. If you have a workflow that is scraping HTML right now, you really might want to look into looking at the out.json approach instead. It's really easy to grab stuff out of it. So you probably, sorry about that. So you probably already understand that there are some input files changes that need to happen. These are detailed on the repo's README file, but I think it's important to go over them again here. We are using the tabular reports, so if they're not already enabled, they need to be. We probably could figure out what subset of reports we are using, but the easiest thing is just to enable all of them using all summary or all summary monthly or all summary monthly and sizing period. We also need to turn on the JSON output option, which is for both time series output and tabular reports. We need to include SI units, which means none under the unit conversion and output control table style. I do understand this may cause some problems. If you need both SI and IP output, you can do that with the SQL file being IP and the JSON file being SI. But right now in EnergyPlus, I don't think there's any way to make the HTML file IP and the JSON file SI, maybe in the future. The weather stat file needs to be present since the climate summary report is one that's used to identify the climate zone and building location. Probably the largest effort, though, is adding some compliance parameters that are included into the space object. We're using space type, tag 1, and tag 2. Space object is relatively new in EnergyPlus, but it's been around for a few years. These need to be values that correspond to enumerations in the lighting space options, ventilating space options, and surface water space options. These are all enumerations in the Enumerations 2019 ASHRAE 90.1 file in the schema. This information is often known by the user when generating the baseline by hand, but is not entered by the user anywhere in EnergyPlus. And instead, they just put the baseline lighting or ventilation or surface water heating values that's appropriate for their space type. This may require a new input for a GUI just for those compliance parameters, which we'll talk about next. And for future versions of createRPD, I am considering putting them with the rest of the compliance parameters instead. So let's talk about compliance parameters a little bit more. As I've touched on, compliance parameters are data elements from the RPT file that cannot be populated by simulation input or output. They may be different for different simulation programs, but there's a certain set of them for EnergyPlus. Generally, they correspond to categorization items like space type or lighting type, but can also be data elements from the rule set that have an impact on other rules, such as if a terminal has supply ducting, or a type of draft used by the boiler, or if a return fan is fully ducted. These aren't things that a simulation program really needs to know. It's encapsulated with some other information, but the schema does. They also simply may be things that aren't computable from other numbers, such as the enthalpy recovery ratio for heat recovery. As I said in the last slide, some of these are related to space type that are currently being used with the space input object. But for phase 3, we're taking on more of them and using a more comprehensive approach, which of course is another JSON file. For GUI, most of these compliance parameters may require additional inputs from the user, but some may come from choices in libraries such as users are already making. The createRPD utility creates a blank file for these compliance parameters and will merge them with one that's been edited. So let's talk about that a little bit more, talking about the command line options. Normally, when you use createRPD script, you would just supply it with the name of the EPJSON file. It uses that file name and changes the extension to whatever other file it needs. To help with the compliance parameters, we've added 2 new command line options. One is create empty CP, or just C. Creates an RPD file that has the same structure with the same zones and surfaces and everything else, but only has the data elements that corresponds to compliance parameters. The idea is that a user would create an empty file and then edit it to fill in all their compliance parameters. And then to get it back into the system, they would use this add CP or -A option. That takes the edited file and sucks it back in so that the final RPD contains both values for the compliance parameters and the values that are extracted from EnergyPlus input and output. This is what creates a complete file. And this thing is really simply doing a merge of 2 nested dictionaries, nothing too fancy. And finally, the last command line option, just so that we talk about them all, is for help, which basically provides a short message that talks about this. So I'm going to do a real quick code tour for those of you that are interested in that level of detail. For those that are not interested, I just have one more slide to cover at the back end, so you could skip through it. But for those that want to stay along, let me walk through all the pieces. So I've got more files open than I know what to do with. All right, here we go. So the requirements text file, you can see, is really got very few requirements. It has not very many dependencies at all. It uses the JSON schema to confirm that the RPD is in compliance with the JSON schema. But if you're doing that separately, you could probably remove it. The requirement for PyYAML is actually only there for my checklist stuff. So that could also be removed if you don't need it. And some of these are just for testing purposes and documentation purposes. So this could really be very brief. The input file script basically is just establishing a bunch of different file paths. So it reestablishes the output file path and the hourly output file path, and these are all based on the input JSON path. So there's really nothing too fancy there. And even easier than that is the output file script, which basically just creates the RPD file with the same extension as the EPJ, or the same root file as the EPJSON file name. Really, the guts of the program are mostly in the translator routine, which all right. So this is a big routine. I probably should have broken it up into more files, but it is the way it is. So first, let's talk about, I'm in the wrong place. Sorry about that. Translator, here we go. So let's talk about, let's start off with just talking about how to add weather files or weather data. Oh, actually, you know what? I was going to briefly talk about the skeleton first. So the top level of a RPD file is created here. And you can see it's just defining dictionaries and putting them up to the next level. It really is not too fancy. So it creates a building segment, a building, a model description, and a project description, and just basically fits those all together. So there's really not a lot there. But the first one that's really got to do something real is this add weather. So let me show you how that works. So basically it's scanning through the output JSON file, looking for familiar faces like input verification and climate data summary, and then pulls stuff out of the different rows. So let me show you first the HTML file. And sorry, I didn't scroll to the right place before I started here. Here's the table of contents. All right, so first let's go to the input verification and summary. So you can see here there's a very simple, everyone's familiar with this, and one of the things here is the weather file name, which we need. And then another thing is if you go to climatic data summary, we need a few things, a couple things from the design day, but then also down here, the climate zone for the ASHRAE climate zone 2A. So that's all part of the stat file. So these things, I guess we're used to seeing them in this kind of tabular format, but just to show you that it's really not that complicated, let me show you where they are here. So, as I said, this is just another JSON output file from EnergyPlus. And the report name info verification summary is right here. You can see all the same data is there than you normally see. And the table name here, kind of weirdly, but it shows up at the bottom as general. And here is the weather file name. And then likewise for the climatic data summary, it starts off with these the sizing period design day table, and you can see here's the design day names, and then the columns are identified here, and they correspond to the values here. So it really is pretty simple. So switching back to the way this add weather file script works, it really is just kind of searching through things and grabbing different pieces of information out of it. And then it builds up basically a little dictionary, a file name with the weather file, and the climate zone with the climate zone. It's actually populated the climate zone up here. And then that's all stuck into the project description for weather. So it really is pretty simple. And let's just do that for another case here that maybe is a little bit more complicated. So the boilers. So again, it's just looping through, looking for the equipment summary and then the table name boiler. Let me show you how that is here. So here's equipment summary, and boiler table is actually one of the things we've added recently. It's down here somewhere. Here we go. So it lists the boilers, capacities, all the things you need to know about your boiler. And then the EPJSON, or the JSON output file. Let's see if we can find it. No, here it is. So, oh no, this is a different spot. Lots of places talk about boilers, but here we go. So here's the table, or here's the table having to do with boilers. You can see here's the table name down here, boilers, and then here is the list of the column headings, and then here are all the values for the two different boilers. So it really is very similar to what you normally see. And so basically it's just doing that. It's gathering up all this information from one file and putting it into another. So it loops through and gathers the information, and then here it comes up with a new dictionary of boiler and all these pieces that are coming out. A bunch of these numbers or things are numbers that need to be converted into floats from strings, that kind of thing. And then let me just show you what it ends up with when we're all done. This is the RPD file, and you can see here all the name of the boiler and what loop it's on and everything else has just been plopped right into this RPD file for boilers. There's a list of 2 of them. So that's pretty simple. So getting back to the source code, let's look a little bit at the compliance parameter handler. So just to start off, it tells you what all these different things that are considered compliance parameters. So this would be a good reference anyway for people to look at. But basically, for building segment, there's is all new, area type, vertical fenestration, lighting, building area type, heating, ventilation, and then the second parameter in each case, the key value, the value for the key value is the kind of the default value that shows up. So that's where all these are. So these are all compliance parameters. And when you generate a compliance parameter, which is what this create compliance parameter is, the entry point for actually creating it. It basically just goes through the structure for the EPJSON input, or I'm sorry, for the RPD file, and it mirrors that for each thing. So if there's 10 zones, it creates all 10 zones with all the compliance parameters underneath those that are necessary. So it basically just creates a structure that you need for that. And then the other one, the other main input point is this merge in compliance parameters, which basically just loads the file and then updates dictionary. And the update dictionary basically is just recursively updating the dictionary and any lists that are involved and putting the two things together. Basically, it's just a deep merge of two JSON files. All right. So status reporter is that little way that takes the YAML file that I talked about earlier and generates the status report. There's really not a whole lot to see here, just basically a way of getting reporting done. And let's see, the last thing I wanted to touch on was a test. So let's go to test for boilers. That's probably a better one. Sorry, I should have had this one in the right spot. Here we go. Here's the test add boilers routine. So basically, it's taking a snippet of the JSON file that is representing the output, the tabular output from EnergyPlus, and it holds that. It runs the routine, and the expected values are shown here, which is basically just, again, a little nested dictionary, and it just makes sure they're the same. So really is not rocket science, but by doing this to all the routines, we know that any changes will break one of these tests, and that will help us debug problems in the future. All right, so I think that's the entire going through of this that I wanted to do. Let me get back to the presentation. So I've probably only answered a few questions that you might have, and I've probably given you some new ones to think about. I'd be happy to try to answer all your questions. You can send me an email. There are some resources right there on the screen. I'd be happy to answer questions for you, and I appreciate it very much that you take a look at this and let me know. So thanks again, and let me know if you have any questions.